12 is a literary creative space. It's in the East Village. Just our neighbors are the National Music Center and the Central Library. And it's a place for writers and creators of all kinds to come in and show their work, create their work, celebrate their work, and collaborate with other creators and writers.
Alberta Printmakers is a artist-run collective, mainly of printmakers working in various kinds of mediums. And one of the things that Alberta Printmakers is committed to is creating opportunities for artists as well. So in terms of collaborating on a project where we would be able to invite 12 different artists for this type of experience that can really add personal impact to their creative practice and challenge them in that way, just seemed like a really incredible prospect.
We have been publishing small chapbooks for a number of years, so we wanted to take some of those writers, invite them to be part of it, and then Alberta Printmakers invited some of their artists, and we matched them together to take some writing. It was fiction, poetry, hybrid writing, and then the printmakers took off with that and created artist books based on what they got. We wanted this to be collaboration, not just focus on the skill involved, but also what happened when we took a writer and an artist and we put them together and we gave them this project to work on together. So we looked at all aspects. We looked at personality, we looked at type of work that they did, we looked at subject matter of both the written work and also what the artist typically tended to focus on. And we matched them up and then introduced them one evening. We invited everybody together. Towards the end of the night, then we revealed who the partnerships would be. And then everyone met each other and spent the next half hour, an hour, just talking with each other and getting to know each other one-on-one and making their plans. And it was quite electric. It was really exciting. Judy McLaughlin had attended our opening, and she is the supporter of the arts. She has a keen eye, and she thought the project needed a larger scope. She approached the library and said, what would you think about having this collection of books at the library? Something along those lines. That happened. And then they contacted us and said, we'd like to purchase all 12 books and put them on display in the new Central Library. And this was just as the new Central Library was getting built.
It opens up everybody's awareness to how the literary arts and visual arts can come together in a way that they might not necessarily be familiar with by reading a book with illustrations or things like that. At the library, you get all walks of life, all backgrounds. Everybody gets exposed to these kinds of ideas, and I think that that's always a good thing.
I lived for a year and a period on probably what is the most romantic street in Calgary, 11A, in the Kensington area. And it was such an amazing street full of stories that I could not resist writing about it, even though I am working on 6 other projects.
We were matched up before I had read your story. So the story was also my introduction to Arita as a person, so much going on there, all these layers, all these characters, all these vignettes, all this history and knowledge about Calgary, and then that matched with wonderfully written observations.
I think they matched us in mind, spirit, and creative interest.
Yes.
Because the moment that I walked into Evelina's studio, I could see that here was an artist that I had much in common with, but also much to admire about. You showed me your initial kind of idea, and I thought it was stunning. And I saw an example of what you'd done before, and I said, go. That when artists collaborate, I think it's best if they collaborate individually and you let both of them go free.
We gave each other a lot of freedom. I think it's nice to see what comes out of it, and that kind of triggers the creativity in a different way, and that's what I really wanted. In this case, it was more like, I would say, a dialogue, respond to each other's. So it wasn't as much as working with as a dialogue.
I think too, with the beautiful piece you did, and part of what is so evocative about it is the way that the houses along the street are all present in your image. But at a certain time, I think the art says to you, okay, this is what it is.
Exactly, this is what came out. And for instance, in the beginning, I decided to do folding because facets in the folds came up as a literal sort of term because you have so many facets in your story. And also the folding in different directions is like the intersecting of all these different storylines. That's why folding became such an important aspect of my piece. And then I decided to take lino cut as a medium to print because I could actually cut the lino in the shapes that had to fit on the folded structure. And so I actually made the two scenes, one on the street and one on the characters, and cut them up in zigzags and printed them alternating on the page. So that's also with having all these storylines that you have and the voice of the street and the winter that's so important in the story. And then the third layer that I printed on top of it was the text, which was developed in relief letterpress photopolymer that I also hand-inked. I hand-inked the photopolymer and printed it on top of the images of the lino.
Well, I think it was inspired by the setting. Like the Glenmore Reservoir pathway is one I like to walk or bicycle around several times a year. And it's a circle, so sometimes you go in one direction, sometimes you go in the other direction. And I just had this idea of two youngish characters, maybe people in their 30s, who are hit by just this sudden, such difficulty and brought so low down in their life. And one is walking in one direction and one is walking in the other direction, and they just happen to meet and share a moment. So I think the concepts came from there.
I think the first thing that struck me was it was two stories, two people, two situations, and the story flipped back and forth from one person to the other, and in the end they came together. And that's something that I wanted to portray in my art book as well. So actually I bound it a little bit differently. I bound it on the left and the right, so all the images that have to do with Jeannie's story are on the left, bound on the left side, and all the images that have to do with Paul's story are bound on the right side, and they overlay one another. And the very last image where they come together is bound on both sides, so it's kind of symbolic of how Susan wrote her story. So the objects that bind it together are UV tubing to represent Jeannie, who's a cancer patient, and a sharp pencil, which represents Paul, who's a high school teacher, or junior high school teacher. Well, the technique I used is etching, which the way I etch is typically black and white, and you can do multiple plates in multiple colors, but I found it needed a little bit of something here and there. I added aquatint, I added chincolé, which is a technique where you add paper. And for that very last image where they come together, even if it's temporary, it was a very optimistic, hopeful moment for both of them, and it needed to be in color. So I added watercolor to that print. I wanted to include the little snippets of text that inspired that image, and I used them as an overlay, sort of a foreshadow, if you will, and also a way to frame the pictures, so in that way the words are part of the art.
Well, I felt more I had written the story and it was essentially published. So at that point you're kind of letting the story go. So I felt I was more letting Sylvia run with it. That was just my approach to it. So she would send me things back for comment and for feedback. But I really felt I was giving it to her to do what she wanted as an artist, rather than try to control it or get involved with it at that point.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, that was just how I preferred to do it. And so at that point, that it was her baby.
For all the pairs that I saw, I think they did an excellent job, and everybody friendships were grown, and a community of artists, writers, and printmakers was established. And like Susan was saying, this project has grown a life of its own. It just keeps taking another step bigger and bigger. So.
The story is called My Mother Closing the Mouth of the War. War starts in the mouth. Right? War starts when people start talking about war, the preparation for it. The act that closes that story also says to war, be quiet. Like if it was quiet, no one would take up arms.
I was really excited that I was given Richard's story because it's very poetic and it's the style of writing that I really love to read. And but it was also, I thought, really extraordinary how well I felt they had sort of paired us, because textiles are really a background for me. I do printmaking, but I would say that I moved back to working with cloth always. Mm-hmm. So it might be printing on cloth or something like that. But certainly textiles are where I think about how I think about what I'm building and what I'm making. And so when he gave me the story, I was immediately thinking about the uniforms, and I was thinking a measuring tape, a spool of thread, a needle, and so there's a lot of symbology in the book, because of course I chose not to put any text in it, but all of the stuff that's in the story is in that book that I've made as well. So because if we open it out, it's a map, and it's the map of the Allied forces coming in to push against the German forces, and there's stitching that's representing the fields, the plowed fields, but it's also the marching of the soldiers in order. I wanted to work with the industrial felt because it felt like a gray-brown uniform, so it's got that reference to the soldiers, and also doing the stitching into it is the repairing of the uniform as well. A lot of the stitching represents the 24 soldiers that had come in, so there's 24 lines inside each of the arrows that are pushing in the one side.
I think the work became greater. I think what you did was wholly in your own language, and thus it was a whole piece. Right?
Well, and I think they become a piece together, right?
Yeah.
Like, so the story and this book are like, it's completed. They've completed each other somehow, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel that there was such a lovely building of community, like a bunch of artists that I didn't know. Like, there's a group of the printmakers I didn't know, and then all of the stories in this book, which I'm so happy to have, and I've been reading the stories, and it's really just an introduction to a lot of new people. And art communities are quite small, but there's obviously all kinds of people you never meet, right? So it's been really wonderful. And I got to meet Richard.
There you go.
This is actually an excerpt from a full-length short story collection that I did, and it was that's the title story, How to Build a Street Girl. Once we got together and started talking, and Carol will talk about what she does, employment-wise, or was doing, and it's just so serendipitous that we ended up together, because she works with a lot of youth at risk, basically. So
I've been working as the artist in residence at Hull Services with kids mostly off the street, and mostly who've had abusive backgrounds and very negative childhoods, doing art. And so when I read the story, I totally clicked with it and thought, this is about the kids I work with. And in fact, one of my students did one of the illustrations in my book. And as I read the story, I just jotted down key ideas and words and locations that clicked for me. And I had some etching plates, because my book is full of etchings, with themes that were reminiscent of the story. And then I actually had a student do a drawing, my granddaughter did a drawing, and I also pulled out images from my late mother, who started drawing when she was in her 80s. So it's really a family conglomeration in a book that's an accordion style. And I place the whole thing in a box that becomes a garden shed, because the kids at the end of the story are locked into a garden shed.
I totally let Carol do whatever she wanted to do. I mean, it would be, I couldn't imagine saying, well, you should do this or do that. I wanted to see what her vision was. And just because we were so aligned in I guess, the sensibility of the story, I just had absolute trust. So when I saw the book, it was just like, bam, bam, bam. Like, she just nailed it. Everything that was important to the flow of the story, Carol had just piece by piece until the garden shed, which of course is, kind of the impetus for why the kids get taken away. And just what I loved was that Carol brought kind of the loving side to it. I mean, you brought your granddaughter, you brought your mother. I love that because it just, for me, it made a very dark story beautiful in the art.
I grew up in the country, but I would identify myself as a very happy city dweller, and I was interested in the tension between living between those two spaces. I had written a previous story about from the point of view of the father, and in which these two young boys, Griffin is the narrator of Farmhand. He's 13 years old. He and his cousin get into a fight, and so this is kind of the aftermath of that initial conflict. So in my collaboration with Ryan, I really was just interested in seeing what he would come up with, and it was also a pleasure as a writer to have the experience of someone interpreting your work or doing something new with it. And so right away when we were kind of put together, I was like, I think this is going to be a good fit because of the subject matter and his style. So I was really excited to see what he was going to come up with. He had early on wanted to make a book object. So the actual art object is shaped like a book. And I was like, yeah, that sounds amazing to me. And then he picked a number of images from the story. There are a lot of concrete objects throughout the story that play various roles. And he picked a number of them, and then he illustrated those. And we were really coming up with something new. So the story is called Farmhand, but the actual project is The Hunters, because I think that the narrative turns a little bit through Ryan's artwork. And so, yeah, the story almost seemed a bit more sinister through the interpretation and the collaboration. So it was interesting for me to see how, just to be part of the process, to talk about it, but also really exciting to see what Ryan came up with. So you give someone your story and say, okay, do something with it or create something. There is trust. So I trusted him, and I trusted his artistic vision and also him as a person, right? So I felt like my story was in good hands. And to be able to have a connection to another artistic community has been really interesting and special, because I think that there's something very valuable that I can bring back to my practice from having experienced this kind of collaborative journey. It's been a different kind of experience to create a narrative together, because I don't normally collaborate in this way. And so just having this opportunity has been unique and also generative for me. So.
It actually started as two pieces, and back when I was writing them, I was working paratransit, and I would see people and just sort of imagine what their lives were like, either before they had to use paratransit, or maybe their loved ones, how they interact with these people. And the first story was a man who saw a wasp on the bus I was driving, and he had what I would consider an irrational response to it. He was very agitated. And he told me a story of when he was really young and he was stung quite a bit and had to be buried in mud because they were in a remote location. And the second part of the story was watching a woman get a very tall man, probably about 6 feet, 6 inches tall, into a ridiculously small car. And I was just imagining, why is she taking him in that particular car? And where are they going? Because I knew the man. He couldn't talk, he could blink, that was about it. So I started to write her story, just my imagining of it. And neither one of those stories had an ending. And then one night, just can't sleep, and the ending that they could each end each other. So I combined the two of them, changed the gender of the characters in one of the stories, and voila.
We were just told that we were the pair, and I was given a copy of the story, and we chatted for a bit, and we're kind of like, oh, we get along well, so this is great. And so I took the story home with me, and then read it a bunch of times to, see what I wanted to pull from it. And after reading it, it's a very descriptive story, and I got a very good sense of the characters and what they were doing. And so I didn't want to just sort of replicate that in my work. So it was a bit of a challenge, just because I was here's this very, these very real people, and I don't just want to sort of illustrate them because it feels kind of like a shadow of. So it's kind of what do I want to bring to the story, or what's something else, what's another way I can give people an entry point into this story, and that sort of thing. And I was very interested in, I think when we initially talked about the two parallel stories, or talking about how there were two stories without an ending, and reading it, that's really what came to mind, were these echoes of what happened in one story and the other, because they end kind of by meeting at that point, and then that meeting point also echoes an older story as well. So you kind of have all these things coming together. And so then that's what sparked me to think about, I want to draw attention to the fact that these are stories coming together. I put in sort of there's the river, that's the one path, and the road, that's the other path. So the idea of the river path and the road path meeting in the middle. And in the central panel, there's the bridge, and that kind of links the two, because that's where ostensibly the two stories meet up.
I do have a bit of a design background, and the first thing I said is, this is Heather's project, and I don't want to be involved in it in any way other than, here's my story. I think that once you publish something as a writer, it's no longer yours to decipher. People bring their own expectations, their own moral background, their own delusions to the story, and that's what they get out of it. When she first handed me the book, the first thing I thought of when I opened it up was an accordion map I love maps as a child, and I mean, as convenient as it is to have Google Maps on your phone, there's nothing like unfolding a paper map and having suddenly 18 square feet of paper in front of you. It was great to be part of. It's amazing watching somebody take your work and interpret it and come up with an object. I mean, it's an unbelievable feeling.
I was walking along 4th Street one day in Mission, and I noticed all these condos going up. I realized that what was going on here was that a lot of those lovely little wooden houses were coming down. And I just started thinking about the people, so I got a little bit depressed as I was walking. And then the narrator of this story just started talking to me. And I got out my little notebook and just let her talk. And when somebody like that presents herself to me, I basically just become a scribe. So that's often how a story begins. I mean, after that, I spend a lot of time crafting, etc. But I spend a substantial amount of my writing time is spent basically as a listener to whoever it is.
It was such a coincidence that they put us together, because being asked to respond to someone's work when it's completed, when you're not creating this thing together, it's very fortunate if you respect the work. And the story's wonderful, and it's very strange. Rona and I lived in Mission roughly at the same time, might have passed each other going to get a bagel, and it was just amazing that the story just resonated so much, and the characters so full, and the writing, the more I analyzed it, it's a short story, but reading it again and again, just the generosity of not filling in all the blank spaces in the story. And I thought that that was the track I wanted to go on. I knew it had to be wood, and I knew I wanted a reference to a door, so the front cover was your way into the piece. So referencing building materials and also methods and techniques, just sort of subtly inserting themselves, references to wood like mortise and tenon joints and beautiful architectural drawings.
Because my story, it is about preservation and loss of community, but it is also about love and family. And I think that really comes first. Devotion to family is a big theme in this story, one of the themes. And Carolyn, recognized that. The whole thing surprised me because I really had no idea what to expect. But as soon as I did see it, I knew it was right.
The poetry does take place like a walking trip through Kensington. And also the narrator kind of is also walking through time, thinking about what is lost at the same time, like the absence of Buffalo, the change in the place historically and where we are now.
The thing that struck me about looking at the poem is that it's presented in a certain way. And even to read it, there's a certain visual narrative, and there became a question of how would I even read it? Mm-hmm. So I got in contact with Wayman, and I brought a recording device, and I recorded Wayman reading his poetry. That was my entry point. Wayman's poem has a lot of not only word content, but there's a lot of sound. And so if you listen to him read it, it's like a performance.
I didn't want Kate's response to my work being just a reproduction of my text. I wanted her to bring what she is versed in as a visual artist, and she delivered.
So there are, I guess, three basic elements that inform the actual final piece, and that's the accordion shape, which have the image of the isobar repeating throughout of it, as well as the layered landscape with different pictorial elements on top of them. But then there is a ribbon that weaves through, starting from one end, throughout the center of the book, and it scrolls. That ribbon represents listening to the poem in real time.
Yeah.
I took an ink and pen, and I listened to Wayman's poem and did a visceral linear response, almost like a calligraphic line.
Almost like automatic writing.
Yeah. To the poem. So it's in real time. So I listened 6 minutes, 58 seconds, and that's what that ribbon
around
is.
Little known field equation that also lays down Fibonacci florets for cabbage and telomeres.
It was such a great pairing.
Yeah,
it was really great. Yay, still is.
She's my buddy.
I would consider the short story to be baby boomer lit, which was recognized at the end of 2012 as a separate genre. The character, Deborah, is 55, so she's a younger baby boomer. She's already dealing with some of these issues because she's a widow, and she's also concerned about her mother, who's just gone into a nursing home.
In my work, I like repetition. I like look for pattern and stuff.
And so when I read Elena's short story, I definitely wanted to explore the idea of the breaststroke, how Deborah only did the breaststroke. So I thought that was really telling, and it interested me a lot. And the idea of going up and down the lanes, repeating that pattern over and over again. So that's how the basic imagery came about, was that way. The shape of my book, and the book is kind of a loose description of it, is in a circle form. So I like that idea of repetition, and I imagined when I was doing it that it would be, you could either view it on the wall or walk around it.
Well, I found a real pleasure to work with Heather, and was lucky to get paired with a talented artist that produced some great art. Because my story was already written, and what she was doing was not illustrating it, but taking things from the story that would inspire the art.
So Elena's wearing a pin that I made out of clay, which is actually printed and then fired in a kiln. So I did a variety of bathing suit pins. So again, that was sort of an inspiration. I read that passage and really liked it and thought, oh, what could I do with that? I did some research and found that there are very few circle books, and now I know why. Especially when you're printing it on a continuous piece of paper, because as you're printing, which can take layers and layers, if you screw up, then you have to start over again. And I did like 3 times. And it's a big piece of paper. I think it's 52 inches around. It does fold into a book, so it actually does fold. I found that this project really interesting, and the outcome, I mean, having it permanently installed in the library definitely is something to be proud of, like the writers and the artists. So I really appreciate that. And just the different approach I took with this is different than anything I've done before. Like I mentioned that I haven't made artist books before, so it's something that I would think about doing again, for sure.
I think the main inspiration was hearing another writer on the radio saying, oh, every Calgary writer has a Stampede story. And I thought, I don't. But it filtered away for years. It's a way to play on nostalgia and people's good feelings, and then work with that in a story in a disruptive way. It's a 13-year-old girl, Wendy, who goes to the Stampede grounds with her family, and that would be her mom and her dad and her older brother, who's like an adult. And then she gets a crush on a dancer that's on the midway and looks to ditch her family, and succeeds in ditching her family, and has a get-together with the dancer.
Well, I came out with a sense of a cautionary tale. Like, to me, it was very strong, an urban cautionary tale, and it wasn't necessarily like, usually it's a folk tale depicting something in the woods. For me, it was an urban tale. For me, there was a lot of backstory to everything. Sense of fate, a sense of destiny, sense of something that sometimes things are beyond your power. There might be something else conjuring in the background, and also like very strong the two the friends. For me, they were not necessarily friends. I could sense this sort of like a competition between them.
I hadn't really thought through that maybe they were not great friends, or that, you know, maybe girls that age weren't that great friends, although there's all sorts of books written on that they were kind of mean girls. Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought through that part, so it was great to see the image you made of them, because then I was like, oh yeah, totally, they are part of the issue here.
And I consider this as a story that was, when you return to school, the next, I guess you would have been a freshman or something. And what did you do for your summer vacation? And so that's why it's in the form of a scrapbook. And then it's tied up with bootlaces, as if it was cowboy hiking boots or something. It's interesting the way that they paired us together, because I consider myself a magic realist, expressionist magic realist painter or printer. And I don't think the people necessarily are that familiar with my work, so it's interesting that they cottoned on to that.
Yeah, like I write a lot of magic realism, but not this story. So this is just total realism, kitchen sink realism going on here. Yeah, so that is interesting.
Yeah.
I was surprised by how much the work was, like I've heard my writing described as Alberta Gothic. I don't even really know what that is, but I would say the drawing has a Gothic, Sally's work has a Gothic aspect to it, like that, how that worked together for a Stampede story. Yeah.
So I wrote a hybrid poetry text about the life and death of my uncle. It was really just a way for me to kind of explore family dynamics and how the dynamics of my family today are influenced by my uncle's death in 1995. The most important part of my poetic practice to me is to have strong imagery and be able to like feel a poem with all 5 senses.
So we met one winter evening, and I was basically given this text to work with, and met with Aaron a few weeks later to talk about it. And really my approach to the book was to try to honor the text and treat it as a book. I mean, there's lots of different forms of the artist book, but it was obviously important to Aaron to have all of the text included and have it as a complete text. And then really treat it as a kind of hybrid art piece, just written word piece. So I approached it from, Aaron was able to give me some of her uncle's things. So some of the images in there are derived from actual objects that he would have used climbing mountains or taking pictures of mountains and that kind of thing. And then some of the things are pieces that have meaning in the text but are meaningful in my life as well. So it's a bound collection of 10 or 12 prints, some of which are chopped in half because of the way I chose to, the way you bind it in order to have the images be seamless that way. Some of the pages with the layouts, I used some prints on rice paper, so you can get you can sort of honor the whole object, but still have the text behind it, because there's always a tension when you're like I didn't want there to be a hierarchy between the images and the objects. I wanted to integrate the two into that.
I really enjoyed working with an artist and having that aspect, that layer added on to the writing and the publishing process. And it was such a great experience to have someone interpret your work and add to it in such a meaningful way.
It was a great collaboration it's a funny sort of word to use, collaboration, because the way Aaron described it, I had this text and worked with it, and I think I brought it to you when it was in a prototype phase and said, what do you think of this direction? Because it's quite a personal piece of writing to work with, and I wanted to honor that and honor Jeff's life and death in a way that would work, because I knew it had tons of meaning. But other than that, it was kind of Aaron did her bit and then I did my bit, but it really feels like it was meant to be. So.
In my writing, I've always really wanted to tackle Italy, but it's so hard to do so in a not cliched way. So I was trying to rack my brain about what was the weirdest thing that had ever happened to me in Italy, or what was the least cliche thing I could think of. And it was when I visited this museum, the Keats Shelley Museum, and I saw Shelley's ponytail. So a dead guy's ponytail was the the motivation behind the story. The protagonist is a grad student poet. She, on a whim, decides to go on a trip to Rome, and she kind of comes upon this ponytail, and it unravels a lot of the issues about her father and his death, and her avoiding her academic career at this point, and her identity. And I won't give away the ending, but hair figures a lot, or lack of hair, or what you do to hair, and how that can become a crisis.
I thought it would be nice to as a base for the story, embed or include human hair into the pages itself. I love working with materials as a visual artist and letting materials help to tell a story or create a narrative. But working with the hair was kind of disgusting also, because it was all different colors and all different lengths and textures, and then you put it into this wet mass. It almost was like it was alive in some way. It was reanimated. I liked how the end result turned out, because it looked like it had this white background of pulp with this strands of hair randomly, through it. But from a distance, it actually kind of imitated the look of marble.
We chatted about this idea that she had early on, and I was like, that's such an amazing idea. Let's make paper out of hair. That's great. But when hair is an abstract concept, I think it denotes something entirely different than if you're touching hair. So once you start to touch this paper or look at this paper, like, there's a revulsion that comes with it. So you're attracted to it, but you're also repulsed. It was interesting to see, a 5,000 word short story distilled down into like 12 phrases or 12, little bits of text. And to see, if someone's coming to the artist's book as the first read, what kind of experience will they have of the story? What will they think the story is about, even? It feels really good to have someone respond to your work. So it's like, what did you think of my story? And what were the most interesting parts to you? Please do tell. So in that way, it was really fun for me to see how someone else interprets my work and what other art they can create out of that art as well.
I feel like it worked really well as a collaborative duo. We did collaborate again on another artist book that I wrote a grant for after, and Caitlin wrote another piece for me. The artist book looks very different than the one from this project, but because it worked so well in terms of our communication, it was very fulfilling in that way.
As a writer, it makes me pause a lot more now to actually look at the text and read the text with a keener eye. When you see what somebody else draws from a piece of text artistically, you may read that piece and say, I never read something and appreciate the texture or appreciate how to visualize two storylines put together as one, or how would I, if I could artistically respond to a piece of text, what would I do now that I've seen this? Because the responses were so varied and so surprising.
It has opened my eyes to looking at literature and even visual arts in a much different way, just appreciating the challenge that each the artist and the writer would have had. There's a vulnerability in that entire experience where I can see why those relationships have been forged and really come together as well. I think everyone's just kind of just like, wow, because when I mentioned this at any of our meetings or with our membership, just how much this project has grown and that it still continues to grow. It's unbelievable, and everyone is still getting very excited about all of that. And so whether or not people are going to see it at the library or not, like, people are starting to know what printed word is and what it stands for and what it means.
Yeah, and even to have the writers and artists still be interested. Mm-hmm. We started in January of 2017. I mean, we put our application, so we contacted them, I don't know, halfway through 2016, and here we are. Yeah. And they're still like, yeah, all right, let's do the next thing. This is a long project, and everybody is still here and still excited about it, so